It's August 22nd, 2007. We're here in English Harbor and going to record some of Mom's wartime memories now.
Well, war was declared on September the 3rd, 1939, and I think it was a Sunday. And I was at home. I remember my father was there and one or two friends, and I believe my sister Valerie was there. And we were told that there was to be a pronouncement by the Prime Minister at, I think it was noon, so we waited for that, and Mr. Chamberlain came along on the radio and said we're now at war with Germany. And very soon after, in a matter of minutes, the air raid siren sounded very loudly. And I'm sure several people thought, well, here are the bombs immediately. But we never really knew. Either it was a mistake and somebody had pushed the button, or there was some malfunction, but of course it was not an air raid. However, I remember leaving home soon after to go back to my farm where I was working. I was on a course of dairy farming at a farm nearby, and so I was due back there anyway, so I went back and continued at the farm. And then a little later I registered with the Land Army, the Girls' Land Army, Women's Land Army it was called, for the war service. And various things happened, but it transpired that a little later, when I was at home one day, a day off I imagine, that I was talking to one of the 4 doctors who were billeted on us. In those days, if you had any spare rooms, any spare bedrooms in your house, you were told that you must take in people from London to get them out of the city, which was obviously going to be bombed, out into the country. And in my home, we had 4 empty bedrooms, and my father was told that he must take 4 expectant mothers, and he objected to this because he was there all alone, and he didn't think he could manage 4 ladies who were expecting during an air raid. So it was changed to 4 doctors, and it was one day when I was home, I was talking to one of the doctors, and he said, you really don't want to work on the land for the duration of this war, do you? And why don't you come with me to my hospital and I'll show you around, and perhaps you'd like to become a nurse. And so I did that, and that was in, I suppose, October, November. And I thought that this was a better idea. And I applied to the Land Army, Women's Land Army, to be released to go into nursing, which is, I think, about the only service one could be part of, apart from going into the forces. And they very reluctantly said very well, and I left the Land Army, and on December the 31st I went to London to begin my training on January the 1st, 1940, at the Prince of Wales's hospital, which was in Tottenham in North London. And this was the hospital where this doctor who was living at our house had taken me. He was a neurologist and he was on the staff there, so he took me up and I had an interview with the matron, and she said, yes, you're to start on January the 1st, which I did. And it was I arrived on the night of the 31st, I remember, and on the morning of the January the 1st, all the new probationers, we were called, were lined up and told where to go and what to do and how to get our uniforms and how to behave and so on. You were on probation for 3 months. Then if the matron considered that you were not suitable for nursing, you had to leave. So if you could get through the first 3 months and you were approved of, you could continue your training, which was for 4 years. And I remember it very well. I must say, one thing about it was that we had our own bedrooms. I had been at boarding schools for years and had to share bedrooms and dormitories in the past. And this institution, we each had a bedroom of our own, which I thought was very good. It was quite strict. I remember we were only allowed to have 4 possessions of our own on our little table in our bedroom. A hairbrush and a comb and something and something else, just 4 things, no more. However, we were given our uniform, which was would be considered very peculiar now. It came down almost to our ankles. Blue and white striped dresses with huge sleeves and starch collars, starch cuffs, and a big white apron, and black woolen stockings and black shoes, and a peculiar little cap that we wore on our heads. And they dressed us up in all this. We new girls. And then our names were read out as Nurse so-and-so and Nurse so-and-so. So Nurse Fortescue was to go to Alexandra Ward. It was a big old hospital named for the Prince of Wales, which would have been King Edward VII. And it had long, long wards, 26 beds. And I don't think very much had changed over the years in the layout. And it was very strict, but quite kindly. And of course, on the first day, one had no idea what one was supposed to do. In charge of each ward, there was a sister. The sister was everything. She towered above the doctors. They were, what she told the doctors to do, they did, the junior doctors. However, I won't go into it all, but it was quite a change from mucking out the cows, as we used to say. And it seemed to go along quite well. At first it was very quiet, and then the bombing started. They started bombing London. Of course, we were in London, in Tottenham, and became very busy, very complicated. There were certain wards that were to be kept empty for air raid casualties, but we had other patients we had to put in, and so on and so on. Finally, it became very familiar to us new nurses. We had to learn very quickly. We had our hours on duty, on day duty. You went on at 8 in the morning, and you had either 2 to 5 off in the afternoon, or you went off at 6 in the evening, so that was quite good. But we always had to come back if the air raid sirens sounded. And we also had to go to lectures, which, after you'd been on night duty all night, you had to go to lectures the following morning. It was difficult, really, to study. However, and the exams came up regularly, and we were taught nursing, really, basically. Sometimes it hadn't changed much from Florence Nightingale's day, I think, but it was a good training. And so I was there at the Prince of Wales's, and gradually went up to 2nd year nurse and 3rd year nurse and staff nurse, and I eventually became a sister. And during that time, the hospital, part of the hospital, did receive a direct hit with a high explosive bomb, but it wasn't on the wards, it was on the outpatients buildings and the X-ray, and we were very fortunate that we weren't hit in the main hospital. Then on
Was this a V1 that struck the hospital?
no, this was long before the V1s. This was an HE, a high explosive. At the bottom of the grounds of the hospital was the railway line, part of London's railway track, and it had anti-aircraft guns on the railway line on wheels, and they ran them up and down during the air raids. The guns would be going off, and I think probably they were trying to get these anti-aircraft guns when they hit us. But it was very busy, of course. We did get a day off. I think we had one day a month off and then parts of a day. It was quite exciting, and we were very young, of course, and on a day off one could go into London and go and have a meal, such as they were, or whatever, and if you had a boyfriend in London, well, of course you could meet your boyfriend. And sometimes you even went to a theatre. The theatres kept playing. But there was always the race to get back to the hospital, because if you were late, you were in very grave trouble. So we went on, and I made a lot of friends there, and I really enjoyed it. Some girls didn't, but I did. I enjoyed it very much. And then on at one point we were sent away. Every now and again we would be sent away to another hospital who needed nurses for a particular reason. And at Dunkirk I was sent with I think there were 6 of us sent to a hospital out in the country in Hertfordshire to help staff a hospital they'd opened for the Dunkirk wounded. And they came back. They had built these long, they were called Nissen huts. They took 48 beds in each hut. And they were fairly basic, but they were very necessary. Afterwards, I think there was general confusion, because instead of going back to London to our own hospital when the Dunkirk people were transferred, some of us were sent to the local workhouse to nurse the inmates at the workhouse. Now, I don't suppose you know what a workhouse was like, but if you've read any Dickens, it hadn't changed much since Dickens' day. And they were very grim places, and they took in the old people who had nowhere to go at night, and they were known as tramps, and they would walk from one workhouse to another for overnight shelter. And otherwise they just slept under a hedge or in a field or by the road, or they had nothing of their own. Remember, this was 1940. And we were a bit surprised at being put in the workhouse during our training, but one never asked any questions in those days. So we stayed in the workhouse, I, myself, and a few others, and finally we thought we'd been forgotten, so we were very frightened, really. But we wrote to the matron and suggested that perhaps we could come back to London now. And she said, certainly not, you stay where you are, till you're told to return. And so we did, of course. However, eventually we did get back and finished our training. And then on June the 6th, D-Day, the invasion of France, which was a tremendous upheaval for everyone in Britain. For weeks beforehand, every street and little road and field and farmyard had been full of troops and weapons, anti-tank weapons and guns, and 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 tanks and huge trucks and thousands of men waiting, just waiting for the invasion. And of course everybody knew it was coming, but nobody knew when. And the days went by and the days went by, and then on June the 6th, 1944, it started. And I just have to tell you what the impression was, because it was as though the whole of Great Britain was moving out into the Channel. And so the land was moving, because all these hundreds and hundreds of troops and weaponry and huge tanks and so on seemed to start up at the same time and move south. They were all going in the same direction, down to the ports, of course. And at that time, we were at this hospital out in the country in Bishop Stortford, so they all went by us. And then the invasion started. Then I was recalled to my hospital and told to, actually that was just before I was recalled, and told that it was not to be spoken of, but that the invasion was very near, and I was to pack a small suitcase, and I was not to tell my family or anyone else what I was doing. And with 5 other nurses, junior nurses, I was to be in the hall of the hospital at 6 a.m. the day before D-Day, and no questions asked. And so we 5 girls and myself, we were taken in buses down to a place in Surrey, which was an old mental hospital that had been cleared, and the patients had gone to Wales, and it had 1,000 beds, and we were told that we were to prepare it for casualties, that D-Day was the next day. And so we did. And there were 6 nurses taken from all the hospitals in London and the southern counties to Banstead, which was the name of this hospital we went to. And there we got it ready for the wounded. And it was amazingly well organized. There were hundreds of doctors, and there were medical students, there were surgeons and physicians and everything you could possibly need. And on D-Day plus 2, I think it was, we had the first convoy. And we would have a convoy every other night. They came at night, and they came off the beaches, and were put into trains, I suppose in Dover or on the coast, and brought up, and we unloaded the trains. They came right through the hospital grounds, and we only kept them for 24 hours, just did emergency work really, and they were put back on the trains and taken away. I think most of them went to Wales. They're supposed to go to a safe area. And then we would have a night in between in which we could tidy up and get ready for the next night. And so it went, and it worked quite well. And we were hit by a V1. They were the flying bombs that came across. They came in a steady stream, heading for London, and we were right in the they were overhead at Banstead. They used to call it, they had a name for it, Bomb Alley I think it was. And they came over continuously, and they were frightening things. I think perhaps it was the most frightening thing that we had to put up with during the war, the V1s, because they made a horrible sound, a sort of grinding sound as they came. They weren't manned, of course. They were just flying bombs, really. And then they'd stop, and there would be dead silence. And if it stopped above you, you knew that it was coming down. They came down directly. They didn't glide down. However, most of them went over. We had German prisoners there, wounded, and they didn't like their V1s at all, and they would make a great fuss and say, you know, was ist das? And they didn't like it at all, and they were very indignant, as a matter of fact, and we told them it was their Führer's secret weapon, but they didn't make much effect. They just wanted to go to a safe area, they said, somewhere safe. But of course we told them they were staying right where they were with the rest of us. However, after 3 weeks we did have a direct hit, which was inevitable, of course. And it was a huge old place, a very old hospital, what they used to call an insane asylum in the old days. Vast place. But we had a hit, and it did a great deal of damage. The ward I was on night duty, and very curious things happened during air raids, because each ward, which had about 80 beds in it, at the end it had a kitchen where you were supposed to make hot tea and so forth for the patients. And round the kitchen, which was on the end of each ward, there was what was called a blast wall, which was a sort of brick wall, round part of it, and which was supposed to be bomb protection in a way. However, anyway, we were told that if we thought we were going to be hit, we should go into the ward and get under one of the beds. I suppose it might be some protection. I had one Red Cross nurse with me, and my ward was almost empty, fortunately, because it was the night between convoys. I had about 8 patients in there, so we got under the beds, under the beds, and we weren't a direct hit. It was very close. I think probably the next ward or two were hit, but I just remember the noise of the thing coming down, and then I suppose I was knocked out because I remember looking up and there was the sky and the stars and all the sort of smoke. It wasn't smoke, but it was the remains of the roof, of course, and everything looked, shattered and so forth. But I was fine. I was all right. And I called to my Red Cross nurse, but she didn't answer. I didn't know where she was then. And the next thing I knew was that one of the night sisters, the sisters, of course, were just like gods to us. I mean, you didn't even speak to a sister unless she spoke to you. She was standing beside me when I crawled out and stood up, and she was immaculate. She had a starched apron on, and she had her huge cap with a little bow under the chin and her cuffs on, and she was perfect. And she just said, get up, nurse. And I got up, and she said, is your kitchen intact? And I said, I don't know, sister. And he just stood up, Go and look, she said, and put your kettles on, because heavy rescue will be here immediately. She didn't say, go and look at your patient, or where is your Red Cross nurse? Just go and put on your kettles. Get the water boiling for the tea. Which I did. Then I wasn't hurt at all. And my Red Cross nurse was alive, but she was badly injured. She was right down the other end of the 80-bed ward. I only had those few patients in, and only one man was killed. We were very lucky. However, that was the V1, and of course then we all had to go back to our hospitals in London because that hospital was bombed. I remember all the wiring was alive. If you picked up telephone. We were told not to. Everything was something to do with electricity, but everything was quite alive. However, we went back after that, and it was strange things stay in your memory, because I had been gone 3 weeks from my ward where I was staff nurse, and it was a military ward. It was for the troops, and I had suddenly disappeared on June the 5th and reappeared 3 weeks later, and the men kept saying, "Where have you been? Where have you been, Staff? Where have you been?" And I sort of, "Why weren't you here?" So anyway, we weren't supposed to talk about it, which I didn't. Oh, you know, I was away. Anyway, it went on, and the war ended, and my training ended, and I had to do an extra year, 5 years, because I had been ill quite a bit. And if you missed a day of your 4-year training, you had to make it up at the end. And altogether I had been away about almost a year off sick. Anyway, that was my nursing experience in London. Funnily enough, VE Day is not as vivid in my memory. Well, perhaps it wouldn't be as the time spent in Tottenham. By then I had finished my training, and I was training in midwifery in another hospital in London, a little further out, with my great friend Dorothy. We trained our general together, and we did our midwifery together at this hospital, and that was a 6 months course. You did it in 2 6 months periods, a year altogether. And VE Day came at that time, and I guess there was, of course, great excitement, and I think the routine, which was so strict, was relaxed a little bit, and I think those of us who did get into London. London was extraordinary. It was just full of course, the whole world seemed to be in London, and it was noisy and quite weird. You could hardly get about. I don't even remember getting to London, but I remember the crowds and the music and the singing, and the lights came up. The lights were on. I hadn't seen the lights for so long. And of course, tremendous celebrations from Buckingham Palace, and the King and the Queen and Churchill, and I don't remember seeing that, but it was all taking place at that time, and people were coming home, people who you hadn't seen for years and years, and those that had survived, you know, were coming back, and you had news, and it was an extraordinary time, and yet it was, and then it was all over. That is how I remember it. I remember I had to go back and finish my training, and the world settled down again. But that it really is my only memory of VE Day. And then, of course, the war with Japan. My brother, of course, was a prisoner of the Japanese in Hong Kong, and VE Day came later. And of course, for my family, that was what mattered more than anything, because he and his wife and baby had survived, and they came back. Yes, that's right. My brother Tim, his name was actually Trevor, but he was always called Tim from a little boy, and he had gone out to Hong Kong as one of the ADCs to the governor of Hong Kong, Sir Mark Young, And then, of course, 6 months later, the Japanese attacked, and they were all put into Stanley Camp, which was the camp for the civilians in Hong Kong, those that survived. The military went to another camp. Yes, they were there, and the baby was 6 months old, and the conditions were dreadful. There were thousands in the camp, and the conditions were very bad. But they were young, and they were very fit and very bright. And food rationing, of course, was mostly rice, little fish occasionally, and not very good water to drink. And at one point, apparently, they managed to speak to a god in some fashion. Of course, my brother spoke Chinese, and they managed to communicate to this god. And what happened was that Marjorie gave the god her wedding ring in exchange for one egg. He gave her an egg, and she gave him her ring, and she must have been absolutely delighted. By that time, I don't suppose it mattered about wedding rings. And they had this egg, and they cooked it for Adrian, the baby, and of course he had it, all of it, but he probably had it in very small mouthfuls. Eventually, they were liberated. They apparently, I think it was the Americans that arrived first. Perhaps it was the British ships. They looked out and saw the ships coming in, and the guards just opened the gates and disappeared. They knew what was going to happen to them if they were caught, and they just opened the gates and they walked out. And then they eventually came back. They got back to Britain via New Zealand and on a ship and so on. But you know, it was we knew nothing. We knew that Hong Kong had fallen on Christmas Eve that year, and we had one postcard, 5 years I think it was, and we managed to have a postcard sent by the Red Cross. That was all that we heard until the liberation.
Thanks, Mom. I'm curious, you told a great story. I'm just curious, by my calculations, my sketchy knowledge of World War II, you were in London pretty well throughout the Battle of Britain, and all the bombing that went on pretty well every night, and then for some of the intermittent bombing that went on afterwards, including V1s and V2s. Do you remember the bombing as happening night after night after night, or was it more sporadic? Or what were your impressions of it?
Well, to begin with, in 1940, when I started, the bombing began soon after that, continuously. Yes, I can't remember the actual duration, but I remember very well that it was just part of one's life, because in the hospitals, well, in mine anyway, I'm sure all the London hospitals, you had these messages, and there were 3 alerts, and I think there was a green alert when the bombers were on their way, and then there was orange alert, which was when they left the coast of France. I think that was right, because on orange alert we had to have every empty bed in the hospital ready, absolutely ready. We even had to put the hot water bottles in the beds, which we used in those days, on orange. and we all filled these hot water bottles and put them in each bed. And then red alert, we could hear them on red alert. We could hear them coming, faintly. I can hear it now, as a matter of fact, very faintly. They were approaching London. And then after that, the whole of all the sirens went off, of course, for the whole area, the whole city. And then the bombs were stopped. But, I mean, London was bombed incessantly for I don't know how long now, and so you would hear it, but we only had that one major bomb in the outpatients and the X-ray and so forth. But Middlesex Hospital, a short way down the road, our sister hospital, was bombed to bits. We were very lucky. We were very fortunate because we were in the East End of London, and they would come right over us. And I think, you know, when you're young and you have a job to do and you have discipline, it's not bad at all, and you're all in it together. And the hardest thing was for the old people and the mothers with babies. And of course, all the London Underground stations were turned into air raid shelters. They were filled every night. The trains ran, but they painted a white line down each platform, and as you got on or off the train, you had to stay on the side of the train side of the white line, and the rest of the platform was taken up by people sheltering from the air raids. And there were thousands and thousands of people in the underground stations, and they'd bring their little hot drinks and their bits of bedding and their mouth organ or something, and it was like a sort of little party down there. And you got my place now. I had this place last night. No, you didn't have that last night, you know. And they were Londoners, and they were wonderful. And then at other places there were air raid shelters, and there was when we were in the workhouse in Banstead, and that's just outside London. Of course, we had bombs. We didn't have a direct hit there, but it was a rule that you must get everybody down into the air raid shelter, no matter what. And sometimes it was very difficult to get people down these winding staircases and so forth. But at my hospital, as I say, we were taught what to do, when to do it, how to do it. This was what you did. The only other thing I remember about it was that if you were on night duty on the top ward of this big hospital, one of the top wards was the orthopedic ward, and of course in those days many fractures were up in frames attached to pulleys and ropes and so forth, and you have patients lying in bed with both legs up in the air and so on, and they couldn't move. And we were told that we must never be out of sight of your patients. Your patients are everything to you, and if you finished your work writing your reports and giving your drugs and your medicines and this and that, you walk up and down, nurse. You walk up and down, and you walk up and down, nurse. And you do not sit down at your desk. Patients at the end of the ward cannot see you at your desk. You walk up and down. Well, we go up and down, so we walked up and down. And you were on the top floor, and you walked up and down. And but we were very young and very fit and cheerful, and we were frightened at times. And but the discipline was so exactly right for us. For instance, when we left the hospital to walk across to where we slept and had our meals, the nurses' home it was called, we always had to take our gas mask. It only took 2 minutes to go across, but you had to have your gas mask, and you had to be wearing it properly, which was over one shoulder and under the other one, and you had to have your tin hat. and you were in severe trouble if you were caught walking those few yards without your gas mask. And so it was, I think, that kind of thing, which perhaps nowadays they just think of as absolute nonsense, silly, wasn't silly at all. I think that's what kept us all going, and maybe we've still got a bit of it left over. Soon after the war started, perhaps immediately, I can't quite remember, rationing was brought in. Of course there was food rationing, and there was clothing rationing as well. Food rationing came in very early. I'm sure it was Lord Walton who organised that. It seemed that government was prepared, very well prepared, for the onset of such things as food rationing and so on. However, each person was given a ration book. It was quite a small book, paper, thick paper, pale yellow it was, printed in black print, I remember. And it was full of coupons, which were little pieces that you could pull off and hand in for certain goods. However, having gone into hospital, so I was in the hospital now, and so everyone had to hand in their ration books, and it was handed in to the sister in charge of organising the meals, the food, and so forth. And so she would have hundreds of these ration books that, in order to provide the food for the nurses. And I must say the food was quite adequate, but very dull in hospital. And just one small thing I remember was that on Wednesdays for supper we had a plate of soup, not very exciting soup, a sort of thin brown soup, and an apple, and that was your supper. That was all you had for the evening. And when you were a new probationer, of course, you were put in line in order, seniority. If somebody came to you and started their nursing training the day before you, she was senior to you, and she stood in front of you. One after you stood behind you, and it was very strict. And of course the sisters who'd been there for years and were treated as absolute little, they were wonderful people anyway. They didn't eat with the nurses, they had their own place to eat. However, I just remember lining up for supper one Wednesday and shuffling along and finally getting up to this big black stove. And I was right at the tail end. I must have been my second day, I think, there. Held up my plate, and the sister on duty scraped around in the bottom of this enormous pot with this ladle, and she brought up a little bit of soup and something else, which she slapped down in my plate and told me to, you know, get going. And it was the floor cloth, the thing they wash the floor with. And a little soup mixed with it. And I sat and looked at it, I remember, and I was so overcome by all this seniority and discipline and so forth, I didn't quite know whether I should say anything or not. And my good friend Dorothy Davis, no, she wasn't there then. Whoever sat next to me said, "What are you going to do?" And I said, "I don't know." And in the end I thought, I was so hungry anyway, I went back up, and the whole dining hall stopped and looked at me. And I went back up to this sister. And she said, "Well, nurse, you'll have to be satisfied with your apple, won't you?" Quite sweetly. I went back to my seat and had my apple. Well, of course, the other thing that we had was that we were issued with certain rations for the week. I think this was obligatory. They had to do this. So you were issued with your sugar ration and your butter ration and your jam ration. All the rest of the rationing per person was kept in the kitchens to feed us. So we sort of devised a method, each one of us, by which we kept our 3 little rations for the week and hid them. I think you were supposed to produce a little pot, a little jar. Into it you would be put your jam ration for the week, next one jam ration for the week, and so on. And then you produced a little dish for your butter ration, and another little dish, little jar, for your sugar ration. Well, this was a big, big problem, because when you were on duty, you had to bring your rations with you, because you went straight from the ward to the dining room. So you couldn't go back to your bedroom or somewhere and get your sugar ration because you were going to have a cup of tea in the dining room. No, you went straight from the ward and straight back to the ward. So you had to hide it. So we all had hiding places. And we really got very cross and upset if somebody else found one's ration. And there was very many places to hide it on a big ward in a hospital, but we somehow managed, and I think somehow we were quite good to one another in a way. I mean, if you looked behind something or other and you found somebody's butter ration only half gone, it was very tempting to just scrape it into your ration, you know. But I think we were pretty good, really. The butter ration was 2 ounces a week, and the jam ration seemed to be 2 spoonfuls. They would put 2 fair-sized spoonfuls of jam in your little bottle. And the sugar ration, that was, I think, perhaps 2 ounces, something like that. But the great problem was whether to enjoy your butter and jam ration on the first 2 days, or to scrape it up for 7. Now there were the 2-day people and the scrapers and scrimgers and scroungers and the rest who had a tiny little bit each day. This seemed to consume our waking hours. I'm afraid I made mine last. I couldn't bear the thought of dry bread at the end of the week. And then you had 1 egg a week, but that was nothing to do with us. That went to the kitchens. But for the civilian population, there was an egg, and that was the that was the ration, the butter, jam, and sugar. And then, of course, if you were a mother with children, you had the children's ration books, and there were certain things. There was so much meat per week, and so much flour, I think, and rice and so on. And but it was marvelously well done, and nutritionally, and nobody really suffered from rationing. There was enough if you were sensible and careful and so on. We weren't short. And all babies had some sort of orange juice and iron supplement. The children during the war were very fit. They were in great shape, and they were taken care of. But in hospital, I must say, there were times when I wish we had a little more. And then, of course, there was clothing rationing, which was really quite funny, because hats, you could have a hat. unrationed. There was no, you didn't need points. You had points for clothing. And a coat was 28 points. And that took up most of a year's points. But you could have a hat and you could have handkerchiefs, no points. And so people made many of their clothes out of tablecloths and curtains and anything they had. And you know, you see people walking about in a coat which is obviously made out of good, strong, brown bedspread or something like that. And that was fine. We were all in it together. But you had to consider your points very carefully because they were very precious. And the only other thing I remember not on point was candy, sweets, we called them. Sweets went on point. That was a good idea on the half of the government who thought of that. I don't think anybody suffered from rationing. It was deadly dull. And it went on for, what, 5 years? Even when the war ended, we were still rationed. The restaurants and the hotels tried so hard to make it interesting and thought up wonderful names for the food, which we all knew was just the same old food we had at home. And dressed it up with glamorous French names and so on. But I don't remember any other rationing apart from food and clothing, but I'm sure there were other things. But we all came out of it, those that, you know, came through it, quite fit, quite well. And I do remember in the hospital, the night nurses had to cook the breakfast for all the patients in the ward. And each man, when there was bacon, each man had one rasher of bacon, I remember. And then we had 2 little gas rings that we had to cook for sometimes 26 patients on 2 little gas rings, and it must be hot, nurse. And we used to make porridge in a great pot, and on top of the pot of porridge we put the frying pan with the bacon in it, hoping it would warm it up a bit. And then when we moved the porridge over, we slapped it down on the porridge ring, and then you had to boil the kettles as well. Anyway, all went well most of the time, and it's a great time. I'm very lucky to be able to remember it, I think.
There also is a story of some very fastidious rats that I'd like Mum to relate to us now.
Well, this happened when we were at Banstead, which was the casualty clearing station I mentioned, where we had the first wounded back from D-Day. And we had these enormous wards. I think there were 80 beds, 40 beds each side. And there was a bed and a locker by each bed. And it was very strictly controlled, and of course it was military, so it had to be done very correctly. And in the bottom of each locker, on the left-hand side, at the bottom, was a cake of soap. And in those days, I think it was Lifebuoy soap, which was very harsh and smelled awful, and was used for washing, obviously, for washing your patient. And it had to be on the bottom, at the bottom of the locker on the left-hand side and nowhere else. Well, I went on night duty at one point, and as I say, this hospital was very old mental hospital, and had never been updated, I don't think. And there were huge cracks in the floorboards. And at night, usually when everything had been settled down and everything was quiet, the rats would come up. When I say the rats, there weren't hundreds of rats, but there would be a rat here and a rat there and a rat somewhere else, and they'd come up through these cracks. You'd see their snouts come out, their noses and their heads, and they'd come up and they knew just what they had to do, and they would go to these lockers and they would push the soap out of the locker onto the floor, and then they would push it to the crack in the floor, and they would ease it through. Sometimes they seemed to stand them up on end, but they'd ease the soap down through the crack in the floor where they lived, of course, and they would eat it, no doubt. Anyway, in the morning, when the day sister came on, I had to go round each bed with her, and even the empty beds, she would see that they were properly made up and correctly, just so, pillows just so. You must never put the opening of a pillowcase towards the door, nurse. You learned that in your first week in hospital. I still don't do it, because it's untidy. Somebody coming through the door, it's untidy. Yes, sister, yes, sister. Anyway, she would say, "Where is the soap, nurse? Locker number 21, locker number 37, no soap, nurse. Where is the soap, nurse? The rats have taken it," I would say. "Nurse, where is the soap?" "Well, the rats come up. The rats come up at night, sister, and they take it out of the lockers and they push it down through the floor." "Nurse, where is the soap?" It's quite true, sister, that's what happened. I think she thought I was keeping it and I was making a little something on the side, probably by selling it on the black market. But it continued, and we had this little... Every morning she would say, "The soap, nurse, the soap is gone, you know." And I say, "I can't help it, sister, the rats come up, and I can't help it, and they get in the bottom." I didn't say this because you never spoke back to a sister, but I thought if they'd only have a little door on the bottom, the rats couldn't get in, but no. Anyway, soon after that we had our V1 hit us, so rats and all went up, and soap and everything else.